Hello and welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a story about a revolution, one that was born from some really radical ideas. An event so huge that it brought down a 300-year-old dynasty and created a brand new kind of superpower. Yes, we are talking about the Russian Revolution.
So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the big ideas that were changing Europe. Then we'll focus on Russia itself, an empire really on the brink. After that, we'll walk through the massive year of revolution, 1917. We'll see how the Soviet state was forged from the chaos, and finally we'll look at its global legacy. All right, let's jump in.
All right, Section 1, Ideas that Changed Europe. You see, our story doesn't actually start in Russia. It starts with the ideas, the seeds of revolution that were being planted all across 19th century Europe. The old world was crumbling, and people were starting to ask some really dangerous, really powerful questions about who should be in charge.
You have to understand, the French Revolution was like a massive earthquake that shook the very foundations of Europe. For centuries, everything was, well, fixed. You had the aristocrats and the church at the top holding all the power. But then, bam, the revolution just shattered that old order. Suddenly, the idea that you could completely tear down society and build a new one, well, that wasn't just a fantasy anymore. It felt real. It felt possible.
So, out of all this chaos, you basically had three main groups with very different ideas. First, you had the liberals. They were like, okay, we want change, but let's not get crazy. They wanted representative government, sure, but they thought only men with property should get to vote. Then you had the radicals. They went much further. They wanted a government based on what the majority of people wanted, and they even supported the, really revolutionary idea of letting women vote. And finally, you had the conservatives. They looked at all this and said, whoa, slow down. They knew some change was inevitable, but they believed you had to respect the past and do things gradually.
Now, while all these political debates were happening in the halls of power, something else was transforming life on the ground, the Industrial Revolution. And this was a double-edged sword, you see. It created incredible wealth for some, but for the vast majority, it created immense suffering. You had these new cities and factories popping up everywhere, but life for the people working in them, it was brutal. We're talking incredibly long hours, terrible wages, and the constant fear of losing your job. The housing was awful, sanitation was non-existent. It was a really, really tough life. And these conditions, they were the perfect breeding ground for even more radical ideas.
And it's from this very turmoil that socialism emerges. And let me tell you, this was probably the most far-reaching vision of them all. It basically suggested a total reset of the economy. At its heart was this one simple but world-changing idea. What if property and resources weren't owned by private individuals for their own profit? What if, instead, they were owned and controlled by society as a whole, for the good of everyone?
This, right here, was the fundamental clash of the era. On one side, you had the capitalist viewpoint. They believed that individuals owning property for personal gain, well, that's what drives progress. It's all about individual effort and enterprise. But the socialists, they looked at the same world and came to the exact opposite conclusion. For them, private property was the root of all of society's problems. They argued that as long as a few people owned the factories and the land, the well-being of the many would always come second to the profits of the few.
And of course, the person who made this argument most powerfully was Karl Marx. He looked at the industrial world and said, this isn't progress, this is a war between the owners and the workers. And in his view, there was only one way out for the workers. They couldn't just ask for better wages, they had to overthrow the entire system of capitalism, get rid of private property altogether, and build what he called a communist society, the natural and only future for humanity.
Okay, Section 2, Russia, an empire on edge. Now here's the interesting part. Hearing all this, you'd probably think the first socialist revolution would happen in a heavily industrialized place, right? Maybe Britain or Germany. But no, it happened in Russia. A massive, sprawling empire that was mostly agricultural. So the big question is, why there? We need to understand what made Russia, specifically, a powder keg just waiting for a match.
Well, first of all, you have to look at how Russia was ruled. By 1914, it was one of the last true autocracies left in Europe. That means all the power, literally all of it, was in the hands of one man, Tsar Nicholas II. He wasn't accountable to any parliament, any laws, anyone. His word was final, and his government was known for being incredibly repressive.
And this number, this one number, tells you almost everything you need to know about the Russian Empire at the time. 85%. That's how many people made their living from agriculture. Think about that. While the rest of Europe was industrializing, Russia was still fundamentally an empire of peasants. And those peasants were deeply, deeply unhappy. Their problems were about to explode.
Now, Russia wasn't completely without industry. There were pockets of it in cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow. But the conditions for the workers there? Just awful. It was not uncommon to have a 15-hour workday. Can you imagine? Women were a huge part of this workforce, almost a third, but they were paid less than half of what a man earned for the same job. But here's the key thing. Despite all the things that divided them, these workers were starting to come together. They were uniting to strike and demand better conditions.
And back in the countryside, the tension was just as thick. The dynamic was simple. The nobles owned the land, and the peasants worked it. And the peasants absolutely resented this. What made Russia different from, say, France, was that the peasants had zero respect for the nobility. None at all. They would often just refuse to pay rent. And sometimes, things got much, much worse. They would attack and even kill landlords to take the land they believed was rightfully theirs.
So you have these two very angry groups, the workers and the peasants. This led to a huge debate among Russia's socialists about who would actually be the ones to start the revolution. On one side, you had the socialist revolutionaries. They looked at the huge peasant population and said, they are the main revolutionary force. We need to focus on them. But on the other side, you had the social democrats, who were Marxists. They stuck to the classic theory. No, it has to be the industrial workers. They are the only ones who can lead us to true socialism.
And to make things even more complicated, that second group, the Social Democrats, they split into two. And honestly, this split changed the course of the 20th century. You had the Bolsheviks, whose leader was Vladimir Lenin. He believed the Revolutionary Party should be small, highly disciplined, and made up of professional revolutionaries. Quality over quantity. Then you had the Mensheviks. They wanted the opposite. They thought the party should be a mass organization, open to anyone who wanted to join, kind of like the socialist parties in Germany. This wasn't just a small disagreement. It was about the very nature of revolution.
So, with all this tension simmering, it finally boiled over in 1905. It started with economic hardship, prices going up, wages going down. Then came Bloody Sunday, when soldiers fired on peaceful workers who were just trying to give a petition to the Tsar. Over 100 were killed, and the country just exploded in anger. The Tsar, seeing his empire on fire, panicked and offered a concession, an elected parliament called the Duma. But it was all a lie. As soon as a Duma was elected that he didn't like, he would just dissolve it. He made it crystal clear he was never going to give up any real power. So, the 1905 revolution failed. But everyone learned a valuable lesson. It was, you could say, a dress rehearsal for the main event.
Now we come to Section 3, the Year of Revolution. 12 years after that dress rehearsal, the final act begins. And the thing that lit the fuse this time? It was the First World War. This war took the already fragile, outdated Russian Empire and just pushed it right over the edge. It was the final straw that led to the complete collapse of the old world.
Just try to wrap your head around this number. 7 million. By 1917, that was the number of Russian casualties in World War I. 7 million killed, wounded, or missing. The army at the front was literally falling apart. The soldiers didn't want to fight anymore, and the situation back home was a disaster. The will to continue this war was just gone.
And the war didn't just cause devastation at the front. It completely crippled the economy back home. With so many men away fighting, there were massive labor shortages. The railway system, which was already struggling, just collapsed. This meant food couldn't get to the cities. Soon there was no bread, no flour. By the winter of 1916, you had riots breaking out at bread shops. People were starving, and they were angry.
And then, it all just fell apart. In 5 days. That's all it took. It started with women from the factories going on strike, simply demanding bread. But this time, unlike in 1905 when the soldiers were ordered to fire on the crowds, they refused. They mutinied and joined the workers. It was a game changer. The workers and soldiers quickly formed their own council, the Petrograd Soviet, to run the city. The Tsar, sitting far away, had lost all control. On March 2nd, he gave up the throne. And just like that, 300 years of the Romanov dynasty was over.
So now there's a huge power vacuum. And who steps into it? Vladimir Lenin. He comes back to Russia from exile and immediately lays out a clear, radical plan. In what became known as his April Thesis, he made 3 simple, powerful demands. 1. End the war now. 2. Give all the land to the peasants. 3. Nationalize all the banks. These ideas, summed up as peace, land, and bread, were exactly what millions of people were desperate to hear.
Now, if the February Revolution was this spontaneous explosion of anger, the October Revolution was the complete opposite. It was a planned, calculated seizure of power. Lenin persuaded the Bolshevik Party that the time was right to act. On October 24th, the uprising began. A committee led by the brilliant organizer Leon Trotsky methodically took over government buildings. The next day, they stormed the Winter Palace, the seat of government, and arrested the ministers. By December, after some more fighting, the Bolsheviks were in control.
Okay, Section 4. Forging the Soviet state. Look, taking power is one thing, but holding on to it and trying to build a completely new kind of society from scratch, that's something else entirely. The Bolsheviks now faced an absolutely massive challenge, creating the world's first socialist state in a country that was already in ruins.
And they did not waste any time. The changes came thick and fast. Most industries and banks nationalized. The land declared social property, which was basically a green light for peasants to take it from the nobles. All those old aristocratic titles like prince and duke, gone. Banned. The Bolshevik Party even renamed itself the Russian Communist Party. And, most importantly, they delivered on their biggest promise. They made peace with Germany and pulled Russia out of the war.
As you can imagine, not everyone was happy with these changes. What followed was a vicious and bloody civil war. On one side, you had the Bolsheviks, who were called the Reds. They were fighting against, well, pretty much everyone else. Their main opponents were the Whites, a loose coalition of people who wanted the old system back and who were supported by foreign powers like Britain, France, and the USA. And then you also had the Greens, who were mostly peasants who had their own ideas about the revolution and were fighting both the Reds and the Whites.
It was an incredibly brutal war, with millions of casualties. But in the end, the Reds won. Their enemies were divided, but the Bolsheviks were disciplined and unified. By 1922, the fighting was mostly over. They had won. And from the ashes of the old Russian Empire, they created something entirely new, the Soviet Union, or the USSR. The world's first socialist state had officially arrived on the world stage. And that brings us to our final section, a global legacy. Because we have to understand, the creation of the Soviet Union wasn't just some internal Russian affair. It was a world-changing event. This grand experiment, this attempt to build a whole new kind of society, it would go on to inspire hope in millions of people and absolute terror in millions of others. It really set the stage for the rest of the 20th century. After Lenin died, a man named Joseph Stalin came to power, and his main goal was to industrialize the Soviet Union at lightning speed. He introduced these things called 5-year plans. And the results, you have to admit, were staggering. Just look at this. Between 1929 and 1933, the output of oil, coal, and steel, it all doubled. A 100% increase across the board.
But what was the human cost of that incredible growth? Well, this quote gives you a little glimpse. It describes life in one of the new factory cities. In the wintertime, at 40 degrees below, people had to climb down from the 4th floor and dash across the street in order to go to the toilet. Those impressive statistics were built on the backs of people living in just unbelievably harsh conditions. The speed of the construction was so fast that basic human needs were completely ignored.
And if things were bad for the industrial workers, for the peasants, they were about to get even worse. Stalin's most infamous policy was called collectivization. The government basically outlawed private farming. Millions and millions of peasants were forced to give up their own land, their tools, even their animals, and join these massive farms that were controlled by the state. As you can expect, the peasants resisted this. They fought back, often by slaughtering their own animals rather than handing them over to the state. The government's response was swift and brutal. The whole thing led to absolute chaos in the countryside. Food production collapsed, and the result was one of the worst famines in human history. The estimated death toll, 4 million people, a direct result of this policy. And it wasn't just economic hardship. There was also immense political terror. Under Stalin, any kind of criticism or opposition was crushed without mercy. If you questioned the government's policies, you weren't just a critic, you were an enemy of socialism. And by 1939, more than 2 million of these so-called enemies were locked away in prisons or forced labor camps.
But, and this is the really complex part, despite all the unbelievable horror happening inside the country, the Soviet Union's influence on the rest of the world was massive. For the first time, socialism wasn't just an idea in a book, it had a global face. You saw communist parties spring up in countries all over the world, from Great Britain to India. For people living under colonial rule, the Soviet experiment offered a powerful alternative to their Western rulers. Here was a country that had gone from being a poor, agricultural society to a global superpower in just a few decades, and that inspired both incredible hope and incredible fear all around the world.
And that really is the heart of the revolution's legacy, isn't it? It's full of these contradictions, and it's something the world is still trying to make sense of today. The goal was to build a society of equality, but the final question we're left with is, at what cost? Thank you for joining us on The Explainer.